Hello, my name is Mark Taylor, and welcome to the Education on Fire podcast. The place for creative and inspiring learning from around the world. Listen to teachers, parents, and mentors share how they are supporting children to live their best, authentic life and are proving to be a guiding light to us all. Hello, welcome back to the Education on Fire podcast. Great to be back with you again, and thank you to everyone who's been sharing the show. I really do appreciate people getting in touch. You can do that through educationonfire.com. There's a get in touch page there. Always delighted to hear your thoughts and anything that I can do to help support the amazing work that you're doing. Now, today I'm delighted to be chatting to Matthew Kincaid. And Matthew is an essential voice in revolutionizing American education, and his vision for a more inclusive education system is a beacon of hope, inspiring educators and advocates nationwide. Now, we have a fantastic conversation about the work that he's doing, the book that he's written called Freedom Teaching, and how that's kind of intertwined with what he's been doing with his personal experiences, how he's kind of become this advocate for kind of creating education that's going to be best for everybody, no matter what your background, no matter what your circumstances. So this is a really inspiring conversation. I really hope you enjoy this conversation with Matthew Kincaid. Hi, Matthew. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Education on Fire podcast. Always great to chat to somebody from across the pond, so to speak, and also someone that's really using their skills and experience to make such a difference in the world. So yeah, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited for our conversation today.
So let's start kind of, if people don't know who you are and exactly what you're doing and where the book came from, give us a sort of a short potted history in terms of where you are in the world and sort of how this sort of developments come on.
Absolutely. So my work is rooted in the United States. We do specifically anti-racism work. We support organizations through the process of both envisioning as well as actualizing anti-racism priorities so that schools, institutions, healthcare providers are equitable to all people. You may or may not be aware, but in the United States, racism is something that we are still working really hard to root out. And so I have been doing anti-racism training since I was 14 years old. And the book specifically focuses on how we can make schools work for all kids. But the work that I do with Overcoming Racism is really about how can we make all public spaces, all institutions equitable to all people and accessible.
And so sort of take us in. I mean, 14 is it's a young age to be kind of sort of getting into that in terms of really understanding it and it being part of your life. What sort of happened sort of between there as you then sort of went into that professional career?
Yeah, it actually kind of flows a little bit into my educational experience. I think is one of the big precursors that kind of launched me into this work. I grew up in extremely predominantly Black neighborhood in St. Louis, Missouri, and I went to predominantly white schools. And that's a much longer story. Matter of fact, I talk a little bit about that story in the book. But effectively, I grew up between these two worlds in which in my community, both the racial makeup and the socioeconomic makeup was very different from what I experienced in school. And so from lived experience, I recognized from a very early age the inequities that I saw between these two spaces. I made amazing friends in my neighborhood and community, and I made amazing friends in my school, but these communities never mixed. And so I became acutely aware at a very early age that, even growing up not too far away from one another, kids can grow up and live in and experience two very different realities. And being kind of the bridge or conduit between those realities really gave me a sense and a desire to fight to make things more equitable for all people.
And so what was the feeling that you had when you sort of first sort of understood this? Was it a way of how do I fit in? Should I be different? Should it be a different world that I'm living in? What was that kind of association that you felt?
It's really interesting, right? Because even though the United States obviously has a very storied history with racism, obviously people know a lot about enslavement and genocides that took place in the United States, as well as segregation and Jim Crow and all those things. But we don't really talk a lot about that in our schooling system. And so kids are in some ways left up to their own devices to kind of make meaning of difference. And that was my experience in school. A lot of my white peers from a very early age were very curious about the Black kid who was in their class. And I was the only Black student from, I think, like about kindergarten to 8th grade. And while that curiosity is normal and to be expected, it certainly led to some intensive learning moments for me as a kid, also trying to understand my racial identity. A story that I sometimes talk about is that I believe my very first memory of school was a time when a young white girl told me that I couldn't play in the sandbox with the other kids because I was black. And it was the first time I had heard, this was in preschool. It's the first time I had heard the term black. I knew my color, so I was very proud of that. I knew that my skin was brown. And I was like, if being black is the criteria to exclude people from the sandbox, I'm looking around like, I don't see any black people here. I'm brown, whatever the case may be. And no, she like put her hands on my chest and was like, no, you can't play in the sandbox. And I remember going home and talking to my mother about this and being really confused by what took place at school. And my poor mom, I'm sure that there isn't necessarily a moment when a parent is ready to have what in a lot of black families we call the talk, with her son, where it is that, hey, yes, in this country, you are black and that means some things to certain people, and sometimes people might have a negative connotation to that, or they might treat you differently because of the color of your skin. And I don't remember exactly how my mom broke it down to me, but that was kind of my earliest memory of race. And then from there you build on both experiential learning of what it means to be black in the United States, as well as of course academic learning in terms of trying to make sense of it through books and learning the history, etc.
And I'm curious, sort of following through from that, were there certain skills, certain ways of dealing with people like that you sort of, like I said, through experience, but sort of a way of sort of understanding where the conversations were coming from, where the situations were coming from, that actually, like you say, made it more equitable, made inequality in a way that you could kind of step forward and say, look, this is the world I want to be living in how I'd like to be showing up, and how this works, obviously, as a community where we are at the moment.
Yeah, I learned at a pretty early age that anger has uncanny ability to kind of swallow you whole. And so when incidents of racism took place amongst my peers or amongst my teachers, I think the very natural response to that as a kid who's trying to understand the nuances of race himself is to be angry about it. But I recognized that didn't really move me closer to where I wanted to be. Matter of fact, the times that I responded in anger to experiencing racism, I usually was the one who got in trouble or was punished in school. And so I learned an extremely valuable skill at a very early age, which was how to have these conversations in ways that didn't make people defensive, didn't make people run away, ways in which people didn't necessarily personalize too deeply, what the feedback was that I was giving them. And I think in a lot of ways, that is what is the foundation for why I'm so good at the work that I do now. Because I learned in school, this wasn't necessarily an explicit lesson, but I learned in school the nuances of how to engage people who are different from me. And I think that a lot of the reason why we don't talk about racism a lot in the United States, and quite frankly, globally, is because there's so much fear that if we engage in the conversation, people are going to leave with hurt feelings, or some of our darkest secrets are going to be exposed, or people are going to presume that I'm something that I'm not. And so I learned at a very early age how to connect with people based on the things that we have in common, and how to have really difficult and critical conversations about race without having people leave that conversation feeling like they were beaten down, or feeling like that they're some horrible person. But instead, the reality is that either we're all learning and understanding how to undo these systems, or more than likely we're complicit in them. And so I rather paint a picture of how we can work together than necessarily a picture that causes people to run away from the conversation.
And so, in the work that you're doing, are there kind of themes in terms of reactions that you get, or what people automatically do? I guess, like say, whether it's sort of going, well, I'm not quite sure about this, I'm a little bit out of my comfort zone, and sort of how do you sort of go about changing that? Obviously, in what you just mentioned there, but in terms of there's certain things that you do within the workshops, within the PD that you do, which kind of can really sort of break through those barriers that you can see sort of time and time again.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of the discomfort honestly comes before engaging in the conversation. I think there's a lot of anxiety. People have sometimes been in training sessions that are similar to mine, that perhaps they haven't been facilitated well, or they feel like they've been, singled out, or they've been felt guilt or blame or shame. And one of my mentors, her name was Sharice Jackson, she used to always say, guilt is an immobilizing emotion. All right. Guilt is an emotion that makes people feel and stay stuck wherever they are. And so my goal is never to make people feel guilty about the existence of these structures that they didn't create, but instead to feel empowered to do something about them, and to also connect to why it is in their self-interest to do something about these systems. I think a lot of people think about ending racism solely being about making the quality of life better for people of color. But if you think about the things that anti-racism movements have done for countries, things like integration in the United States, things like expanding access to democracy, things like expanding access to healthcare, things like expanding employment opportunities, significant immigration policy shifts have happened because of advocacy by anti-racists. Anti-racist priorities make all of our lives better. And so for me, it's really about getting people to understand where they have skin in the game, to understand where, systemic racism hurts all of us. I don't want sexism to end just because I care about the lived experience of women. I want sexism to end because as a man, I don't want to trade my humanity for rights and privileges that could be extended to women to basically no cost to myself. And so for me, it's really about just humanizing people in the work. But yeah, I see just about every reaction you can see, from defensiveness to sadness to guilt to shame to anger. But it's really about getting people to understand that our freedoms are intertwined, and that my unfreedom is also tied to white people's unfreedom, and women's unfreedom is also tied to men's unfreedom. And if we actually care about this ideal of freedom, which is kind of the central focus of the book, then we should work on freeing one another, because the rising tide raises all ships.
Yeah, and I was going to come to sort of community, but I think essentially that's what you're saying. If we're all part of a community, it's the type of community we want to live in and the relationships within that community, which kind of sort of builds that picture that you're talking about.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about the book specifically. One, how did it sort of morph out of the work that you were doing, and how have you kind of formatted it for those people to sort of understand how it's put together and what they can get from it?
Absolutely. And just to give a little bit of context in terms of the education system in the United States, obviously we had segregated schools for a very long time. Schools are forcibly integrated as a result of the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954. But you had these significant remnants of racism that existed in our country, where there were a lot of parents who were really upset about the idea that Black children would be going to school with white children. And so in some of the more I guess, well-known cases of this, you had Boston schools integrating in the 1970s, 20 years after this court case decision, and seeing massive protests. In Little Rock, Arkansas, where the Little Rock 9 integrated schools, the governor actually closed down public high schools for a year, because he was refusing. He said, basically, no one's going to go to public high schools in Little Rock if Black children have to go to school with white children. So there is this legacy of racism that unfortunately still exists in our schools. And actually, in the United States, schools are more segregated now in 2024 than they were in the 1970s, when there was a deliberate push to try to integrate schools. A big consequence of that is what I like to call an education debt, which means that some communities in the United States have been invested in as a result of education, and other communities have been historically divested from. And so we see massive gaps in both achievement and opportunity between white students in public schools in the United States and their Black and brown counterparts. And so my book is really about how we can make schools work for all kids. The SAT and ACT is your standardized test that you take at the end of high school to get into college. And one of the best predictors in the United States of a kid's eventual score on that is not necessarily what their reading level is in third or fifth grade, or what their mathematics scores are when they get into middle school or to high school. One of the best predictors of that is actually the zip code that they're born into. And so what that tells me is that we have an 18-year head start, knowing that our school system is working well for some kids and it is absolutely failing other kids. And so my book is about how can we make a school system that works for all kids, and how can we be very explicit about saying that the children of color in these communities are not broken. These children are navigating broken systems. How can we fix these systems so that these kids can also have access to the quality education, which creates so many opportunities in their life moving forward?
And how is it possible, like you said there, that the system is sort of in a worse state than it was 40, 50 years ago? I mean, like I say, you sort of hear the headlines in the news, you sort of see the things on the telly, but I mean, how is that even possible?
Well, I think in the United States, we sometimes have a problem at looking in the mirror. I think that we do a very good job of looking at other countries and some of the deficits or deficiencies that they have. And we do a good job of sometimes pounding our chests or patting ourselves on the back and saying, we're the freest, most democratic, best nation in the world. This is the whole kind of concept of American exceptionalism. But as I imagine anyone who's not from the United States can see, there are a lot of issues that exist within this country. And one of them, and one of the most glaring ones, is systemic racism and the ways in which this country has been founded and built upon that. As a means of rejecting the narrative that we are imperfect, I think what happens is that conversations about racism are oftentimes they are shushed, they're hushed, they're pushed to the margins. Right now in this country, you have politicians who are passing laws that are making it illegal to talk about racism in school, because it requires us to look at our history and to, in some ways, repent for what we have been and to work to be better. You may have seen headlines recently, a political candidate who's running for president saying that the United States has never been racist. And so there's this very odd, in my opinion, desire to present a narrative of who we are that is not in alignment with reality. And so just like any other social ill, or if I think about racism kind of like I would think about a disease, if you go to the doctor and the doctor says, hey, you have this disease and here are the things you can do to treat it, so these specific anti-racist interventions, and rather than treating the disease, you say, well, actually, let's not talk about it, let's not think about it, let's just ignore it, all it can do is continue to worsen. And that is what's happened in our country, is that instead of us facing these problems head on, unfortunately, we've oftentimes run away from these problems. And right now what's happening is that we're actually actively regressing, where we see politicians who are utilizing white supremacy as a means to garner support across the country.
And as the sort of the book sort of flows through, is it kind of taking those skills, understanding and what you've done from your training, and what do you want people to sort of take away from it if they're sort of coming to it fresh?
Absolutely. So the book actually is drawing a lot upon the work that I did actually as a classroom teacher in the United States, as well as a school administrator, and then the work that my organization has done while working with schools all over the country. And so one of the main kind of core tenets of freedom teaching is this idea of creating schools that cognitively empower kids. And this may seem like a very simple thing, and that's mostly because I think most of the principles and practices that we call anti-racist in education are really at their core just best teaching practice. But in schools in the United States, especially in urban areas, a lot of children are in schools where they are taught rote memorization. They're being taught to a test so they can master certain test scores. Instead of, it's about like just transferring information instead of acts of cognition. And so what my book is talking about is how can we make school something that is being done with these communities rather than being something that's being done to these communities? How can we teach kids to be critical thinkers? How can we teach kids to question? How can we teach kids to take intellectual risks? And most importantly, how can we connect what students are learning to school to being relevant to their lived experience? And so they can start applying their learning in school to the obstacles that they face in their real lives. And so instead of school being this place that I have to go to every day where I learn some information that's perhaps useful and other information that is just information, instead we're teaching kids information that they can actually leverage and utilize in their daily life to navigate life's trials and tribulations.
And I think no matter where you are, I mean, certainly in the Western world, there are many educators who'd hear that and go, absolutely, this is what we want to do. But I also hear the other side, and I hear this a lot on the podcast, and this is essentially why we're having these conversations week in, week out, is that within the system, there are so many T's you've got to cross and I's you've got to dot to make sure you do it in a certain way. Like I say, you can't ruffle too many feathers, otherwise this is going to happen and that's going to happen, and people are accountable to all sorts of people. So how is it that you're trying to support people to go, this is really what we want to be doing and what we're about? And of course, it makes so much sense for children to be in that environment. And we wish that could have that sort of silver bullet that's just going to make that happen. But within the confines of, like, say, people's fears and what they want to do and what they think is possible within the confines of their situation, how do you sort of use what you're able to tell in the book to kind of support those to sort of make that difference in whichever way they can?
Mark, that's an absolutely phenomenal question. I don't know if you have an education background specifically, but that is oftentimes what is on the mind of the educator. Educators are oftentimes overworked, underpaid, already expected to make miracles with less resources than what they deserve. And so, in a lot of ways, when people hear theories like this, it's like, wait a minute, you're telling me one more thing I need to learn, one more thing I need to master, one more thing I need to do. And I actually don't want people to think about it that way, because what the data says is that these type of teaching practices are just best practice for the learning of all children. I think when a lot of people think about the word anti-racism, which has unfortunately become a little bit of a buzzword now, they think about it solely from a moral perspective. Well, the reason why I should be anti-racist, against racism, that's all that word means, is that you are against racism. The reason why I should be against racism is because it is the morally correct and right thing to do. It is the morally just thing to do. But as it pertains to education, anti-racism is the structurally correct thing to do. And the reason why we're promoting these teaching practices in the book isn't just so we can say, hey, we're doing right by children of color, or we're doing right by all kids. We're promoting these structures in the book because the data says that when kids are in an asset-based environment, where kids are in an environment that is culturally affirming, when kids are in an environment that values the wealth that they bring from their culture and their communities into the classroom, and that wealth is leveraged in the process of learning, kids persist in school for longer, kids do better on tests, kids retain more information. And so what I'm encouraging teachers to say is that if what we've been doing for the last 100+ years is leading to this massive gap in achievement, in some ways we're working against ourselves. Let's actually utilize teaching structures, practices, and priorities, some of which I guarantee teachers are already doing in their classrooms, but let's be intentional about it. And let's do it in a way that brings along all children. And I actually think that's something that all educators can get behind. And the reason why I believe that is because when it comes to these priorities around changing the culture or the landscape of our country, I don't know if the bankers are going to wake up tomorrow and tackle wealth inequality. I don't know if the oil companies are going to wake up tomorrow and tackle the environment and the ways in which, the environment impacts people of different races and classes and things like that. But the magic that educators have is that we come to educate people because we love children and because we care about the future of our country. And so if we can just have that as our baseline, then that's all the common ground that we need to make things work. And so it's not about this political ideology or that political ideology. It's about raising children well and equipping them with the tools to thrive in a diverse society. And I think everyone should be able to get behind that. And quite frankly, I don't think it should be all that controversial.
I completely agree, and I think that's the essence really of what we're trying to do here at Education on Fire, is having the child at the center of everything that you're doing. Because I think even if you have educators, parents, schools, whoever it is, who are concerned about how they go about what you're saying, which does seem a little bit amazing anyway, because like I say, it makes perfect sense just on that human level. There are so many opportunities to see people who've gone, let's start with what we need. Let's be kind, like you say, let's create the environment, let's give children the skills they need to thrive. And even if you have to then do the test, you still have to be accountable to this organization or that. The results usually speak for themselves, because you've just got children who are absolutely loving life, really engaged in what they're doing, wanting to learn, wanting to be part of a community. And you just see that coming through. It's just that kind of, let's just do it. Let's show what those things can do, show those rewards, and actually, like I say, a byproduct or just being intentional about it just means that it can happen not when the government changes, like you said, but can happen tomorrow, because that way that you're talking, that way that you're educating, that way you've reorganized your lesson is making an immediate impact.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better myself.
So is there a teacher that you remember, or a school experience that you remember, that had an impact? And this could always be good or bad, or like say, from those experiences you mentioned right at the beginning, but how that kind of has sort of directly impacted, one, how you took it into your classroom, but then, like I say, from that organization point of view.
Absolutely. There's the old teacher adage where, kids don't always care how much you know, but they always care how much you care. And, I think for me, the teachers that I remember, and that's several of them, and I can list them, I can name them if you want to, but there are several teachers that I remember that, I think saw me for who I was, that didn't just see me as another face in the classroom, that saw some of the conflicts that I was navigating in school being different, and didn't, lower their expectation of me, or didn't take pity on me or have sympathy for me, but instead connected with the things that I valued. I mean, I've always loved education. It's one of the reasons why I became an educator. I always loved the process of learning. It's one of the reasons why I teach both children and adults. And so, it's the teachers that challenged me, but that did it in a way that focused solely on my humanity and expanding that humanity and seeing me as a person first, before just a subject that would eventually take test scores that they may or may not be judged upon. So, I was very blessed. I had a lot of really great teachers over the course of my educational experience. There are definitely some who are popping in my head that I remember more than others. And just like everybody else, I had a few teachers that I remember because they did the wrong thing and took the wrong action. I think now that I've been an educator, I recognize and probably humanize those people a little bit more than I did as a kid, to recognize that they were adults and people with lives and bills and problems and, all those different things. And, everyone makes mistakes. You can't make every moment with every kid perfect. And I'm sure some of them probably reflect back and say, I wish I would have handled this situation or that situation differently, just like I reflect back and some of the things that I've handled with students before and said, if I had a second crack at that, I would have handled that differently. So, I try not to demonize the teachers that weren't the best, but I definitely appreciate the teachers that saw fit to pour into me and to tell me that I was somebody who could, follow my dreams. And obviously, the dream that I'm following right now is a little bit unorthodox, but I think my parents and my teachers gave me a lot of confidence to say you can do and be whatever you want to be, which is just not necessarily a reality for all young Black men in the United States in 2024.
And I think the essence of what you said there is probably the most striking theme I hear the most. I mean, this week we released episode 384, and so I've heard a lot of those, and it is that sense. It's about how you were made to be felt. How you felt around the person that was talking to you, that human to human connection. And of course, you've got adult to child, often, kind of teacher to pupil. But there's something very powerful about that. And I think the reason I love that so much, especially in the way that we've been talking in terms of the book and what you've been doing in your career, is the fact that it costs nothing. It doesn't need legislation changing. It's just about who are you, who am I, and how can we make the world better? And how can I inspire you or create a thought process or let you step into the world that you want to be in order to sort of take that forward? And I find that such a powerful thing, because I hear it so often. It's already a fabric of what we're doing for those people who are making a difference. And like you said so well before, we think that the majority of educators are doing that anyway. So we're not a million miles away from what really is possible.
Right. Absolutely.
What's the best piece of advice you've ever been given? Or indeed, is there a piece of advice you might give a younger Matthew now, looking back? And I do slightly caveat that with the fact that we don't always take that on board when we're younger as well. But if you never hear it, then how can you take it forward?
So I want to do a quote that I've read. So this wasn't a piece of advice I've given. And then I want to do the piece of advice that I've been given. But this is a phenomenal question and a really hard question, because there's so many different pieces of advice from so many different angles that kind of come to mind. But the quote that I want to kind of recite is from Paulo Freire. He writes the book Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And it is imperative to maintain hope, even when the harshness of reality suggests otherwise. It is imperative to maintain hope, even when the harshness of reality suggests otherwise. I talk a lot about hope in the book, because I feel like we can do almost nothing if we don't hope for and believe that it can be done. And I think one of the things that systems of oppression rob us from principally is hope. You say, I see this thing that is not working the way it's supposed to work, and I feel like I want to speak up about it, but I know that I'm too small. My voice is too insignificant. I'm not brave enough. I'm not this. I'm not that. And so there's no reason for me to stand up and lend my voice to this issue. And so people who otherwise would speak out for change stay silent because they're not hopeful. And so I'm reminded, as I see things kind of regress in this country from a policy perspective, that I have to maintain hope and I have to keep up the fight, because that's what everyone who's ever made change in the world has done. So that's the first thing I just want to say to your listeners, because I think as educators, there are a lot of things for us to oftentimes not be hopeful for. We don't always get the support that we need, or sometimes, we have obstacles that are placed in our way that make our already difficult job more difficult. And so I would just encourage everyone to remain hopeful, even if the current moment doesn't feel hopeful, because that is one of the most important ingredients that we need to change our situation. And then the piece of advice I received is from that same mentor, Sharice Jackson. It's kind of a weird one, but she used to always tell me, Matthew, everything is data. And what she meant by that was that when I would get frustrated, or I would feel like I wasn't reaching a person, or I wasn't reaching a student, or I wasn't seeing the change that I worked for, she'd always say, everything is data. And what she means by this is just saying that change is not something you can put in a microwave. You may inspire someone to make change, and you may not see that change happening. But the information that they're giving back to me is critical data that I can use to improve my practice, to reach another person who has similar mindset or ideals, to, reshape the way that I think about different things. And so for me, I always remind myself of that when I feel like I'm not moving far enough or fast enough in my work, that maybe I just need to sit back and pay attention to the landscape of what I've done and what I've worked to create, and take in the data that I see, and then make the necessary adjustments from there. So everything is data.
Yeah, I love that, because it's not straightforward, and we know our journeys aren't straightforward. And I think one of the real privileges I feel about having this podcast and sharing these stories is the fact that there are many people and many educators around the world who are happily going to talk about education, and then they do the same thing the next day, the day after, the day after. But to speak to people who not only have the values and the want to make a difference, but to then go and create something, whether it's an organization, whether it's writing a book, whether it's sharing those messages so that you know it can be different, and doing that, I think is really, really key. But I think really understanding what you said there is so important, because even when you're trying to do what you think is correct and how you're going to go about that, it's not always going to be easy. It's not always going to be exactly as you think it should be. And so from that, like I say, you need that kind of self-belief, but also, like I say, calculate the data and then decide how to move on and go from there.
Yeah, and change is not linear. When I think about my time working with 7th and 8th grade middle school students in New Orleans, Louisiana, I may have planned what I thought to be the best lesson plan imaginable. And, I've taken all this time, I got my plan, I have my resources. I come in, and for whatever reason, say the kids aren't connecting with it. I think when I was a younger and more inexperienced teacher, I might have gotten frustrated with the student. What's wrong with these kids? This is the perfect lesson plan. What's wrong with them? I now recognize that students are more like mirrors than they are anything else. And oftentimes our frustrations are not with the actual kids that we're dealing with, especially if you're like me and you're talking to 10, 11, 12, 13-year-olds, right? But the frustration is actually the reflection we see of ourselves in the mirror that these kids present to us. And so taking the quote unquote everything is data approach is to say, okay, yeah, I worked really hard on this lesson. There were probably some things that went well about it, and probably some things that could be improved. And the data the kids are giving back to me is that this isn't resonating with them, it's not connecting with them. And so, I have to go back to the drawing board and make it better. And I think that's helped me to not personalize moments like that, where I could maybe take out my anger and frustration on the young people who are also just trying to access the information, and instead recognizing what the data is that they're giving me, what feedback they're giving me, and then making the necessary adjustments to make sure that school works for them, because school is theirs. I think a lot of us as adults, we get confused that school is somehow for us. In the book, I talk about, you'd be pretty upset if you hired a personal trainer and you went to your first session and they just lifted weights in front of you and said, okay, hey, you see how strong I'm getting? And I think a lot of times at school, we do the same thing with kids. It's like we do all the heavy lifting, not recognizing that school belongs to the kids. We're there to help facilitate learning, but the school is theirs. And so if they're giving us critical data back, we got to listen to it, reflect on it, and we got to make adjustments.
Yeah, it's great insight, that. And I think the other thing that strikes me is the fact that every day is different, and every year is different, every class is different, every child's different. So like you say, that continual, I've got the perfect lesson plan, may well be on a Thursday, and then Friday
Yep.
it's different, and the year after it's
Yep.
different. And that's what makes education so amazing, and teaching such a really sort of enjoyable experience. But like I say, you have to step into that and embrace it. Otherwise, like you say, you're going to go round and round in circles.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then it's even worse when it's like first class period of the day, this lesson is a 10 out of 10. Second class period of the day, you've lost everybody. So yeah, you got to make those adjustments on the fly. And I think, having that everything is data mindset is helpful in those moments.
Yeah, I love it.
So thank you, Sharice, for that.
Is there a resource you'd like to share? And this can be anything from a video, song, podcast, book, but something that's had an impact, and why was that?
Well, obviously, my book, Freedom Teaching. No. So I mentioned this book earlier, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. It's just really changed kind of my mindset in terms of what is possible, in terms of making change and envisioning a new education system, envisioning an education system that works for all people. But there are so many. If you're listening in the United States, Dream Keepers by Gloria Lasser Billings. I actually think that this would be a helpful text for any teacher, but obviously it's written from the lens of teachers working in the US, and so it might be more relatable to that audience. I'd recommend that book as well. But yeah, there are so many different tools and resources that have inspired my work. But those two books are probably some of the ones that I go to. Freedom Dreams, I love that book too. Robin D.G. Kelly, just the idea of like dreaming of freedom is something that I think is really powerful as well. But I could go on.
And I think that's the key often, isn't it? Is what you need to realize is that you take something from everything and you just absorb as much as you can. And then from there comes your ideals, how you can put that into practice your way, and things that resonate with you, which don't necessarily resonate with other people in different ways. And I think that's what makes us unique. It makes us be able to make that difference in a way that we want to as well. So yeah, I think it's so really important. Now, obviously, the acronym FIRE is really important to us here at Education on Fire. And by that, we mean feedback, inspiration, resilience, and empowerment. What is it that strikes you when you hear that?
I mean, I just love this acronym because I think in a lot of ways it speaks so directly to the work that I do. I think that in the United States, the work that I do in some ways has been made out to be this very controversial thing that somehow if we talk about racism, it will make it worse. And this is like one of those things they say, oh, you never talk about race or religion or politics at the dinner table. And my work is to say, actually, the more that we talk about these things, the more that we normalize conversations about these things, the more that we can move towards building the society that we all want. And so when I look at this acronym, I think a lot about the way that this work actually works. When people overcome the fears, the barriers of entry into these conversations, and they leave my sessions and workshops feeling empowered. They leave receiving critical feedback that they can utilize and leverage in their lives. They leave recognizing that we do have resilience, that we can, in tough skin and thick skin, that we can have these conversations and still walk away as friends or colleagues or coworkers. And most importantly, you have to inspire people, because you have to get people to believe that the work that we expend for a better tomorrow is worth it. And one of the things that I always say is that I truly believe when it comes to creating an equitable education system in the United States, that we will win this battle. And people ask me, well, what makes you think that we'll win this? If you look at the long stretch of history, the history doesn't necessarily point to the direction of those of us who are fighting for educational equity winning. And I remind them by saying, well, if we truly love and believe in these kids the way that we say that we do, the students that we have the pleasure and opportunity to teach on a daily basis, then winning is the only opportunity that we have. And so it's about empowering one another, building up our resilience, inspiring one another, and then giving each other the critical feedback that is necessary in us to build agency and take critical action towards change.
Amazing. That's put so well, and it just inspires me even more that when you're able to sort of encapsulate everything that you're doing into something that we've been able to put together here on the show. I just think that's brilliant. Hopefully, inspiring people in so many different ways. So, Matthew, thank you so much indeed for sharing everything that you're doing, and also the book. Tell people where you'd like them to go to find out more in terms of getting the book, and also all the training and stuff you do as well.
Absolutely. And Mark, thank you so much for having me on. This has been a very profound experience. You are a phenomenal interviewer and podcaster, and congratulations on your success and how many episodes and folks you've been able to sit across from. You can find Freedom Teaching anywhere where you purchase books online. And then if you want to go to one specific place to learn more information about the book and also have access to purchase the book from whichever book retailer you are interested in, you can go to www.freedomteaching.com. Once again, that is www.freedomteaching.com. But yes, thank you for everyone who has listened. Hopefully you've learned something. And if you're interested in learning more, then also reach out to us on Instagram at Overcoming Racism.
Fantastic. Matthew, thank you so much indeed. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Mark. This has been great.
I really hope you enjoyed today's conversation, and thank you so much for being part of the Education on Fire community. Links and details of today's podcast are in the description, and if you would like to support the show with a small donation, that's a wonderful way to help me bring you more creative and inspiring learning. Please visit educationonfire.com/support, and remember, education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire.